Money can buy politicians, silence witnesses, and erase crimes. But Gabriel Costa learned the hard way that it cannot buy a heartbeat. As his 4-month-old son withered away in a sterile hospital crib, surrounded by New York's top specialists, it wasn't a doctor who uncovered the lethal truth. Gabriel Costa was a man who commanded the shadows of New York City. As the head of the Costa Syndicate, controlling everything from the Brooklyn shipping docks to high-end real estate developments in Manhattan, his name was spoken in hushed, fearful tones. He was a man accustomed to absolute control. But as he stood in the VIP pediatric suite at New York Presbyterian Morgan Stanley Children's Hospital, Gabriel was entirely, utterly powerless. Inside the sterile, glass-walled incubator lay his 4-month-old son, Leo. Leo was supposed to be the undisputed heir to an empire. Instead, he looked like a fragile, broken doll. Over the last 6 weeks, the infant had been steadily losing weight, dropping from a healthy 14 pounds to a terrifyingly frail 9 pounds. His once chubby cheeks were hollow, his skin carried a terrifying greyish pallor, and his cries, once loud and demanding, had weakened into pathetic, breathy whimpers that tore at Gabriel's chest like a serrated blade. "I don't pay you to guess, Dr. Pendleton," Gabriel growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that caused the 2 heavily armed bodyguards at the door to straighten their postures. "I pay you to fix him. You told me it was a cow's milk protein allergy. We changed the formula. You told me it was severe gastric reflux. He's on the medication. Why is my son still starving to death?" Dr. Arthur Pendleton, the chief of pediatric gastroenterology, adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses, a sheen of nervous sweat breaking out on his forehead. "Mr. Costa, I understand your frustration. We are running every conceivable panel. We've tested for cystic fibrosis, celiac disease, even rare metabolic disorders like galactosemia. The MRIs and endoscopies show no anatomical blockages. Physiologically, Leo's body is simply refusing to absorb nutrients. It's what we call severe failure to thrive. We may need to place a surgical feeding tube by the end of the week if his numbers don't stabilize." Gabriel's jaw locked. A feeding tube. Surgery on a baby whose heart was barely beating fast enough to keep him warm. He took a menacing step toward the doctor, the pure, unadulterated violence of his world bleeding into the clinical white room. Before Gabriel could utter the threat sitting on his tongue, the heavy wooden door of the VIP suite swung open. "If you're going to shout, Mr. Costa, I'll have to ask you to step into the hallway. You're elevating his heart rate, and frankly, he doesn't have the caloric energy to waste on your temper tantrums." Gabriel snapped his head around, his dark eyes narrowing. Standing in the doorway was Phoebe Bennett. She wasn't a highly paid specialist or a renowned diagnostician. She was a pediatric ICU nurse. Dressed in navy blue scrubs, her blonde hair pulled back into a messy, utilitarian bun, Phoebe held a tablet in one hand and a tiny specialized baby bottle in the other. Silvio, Gabriel's massive enforcer, stepped forward to block her. But Phoebe didn't even flinch. She just leveled a tired, unimpressed glare at the giant man. "Move, unless you know how to perfectly calibrate a Pedialyte to formula ratio for a severely dehydrated infant." Gabriel raised a hand, signaling Silvio to back down. He studied Phoebe. In the 2 weeks Leo had been admitted to this floor, Gabriel had fired 3 private nurses for either being too terrified of him to do their jobs or too focused on his wealth to care for his son. Phoebe, however, treated him not like a Mafia boss, but like a nuisance who was in her way. "My apologies, Nurse Bennett," Gabriel said, the sarcasm dripping from his voice. "I was just inquiring why the finest medical minds on the East Coast are watching my son die." Phoebe walked past him, ignoring the suffocating tension in the room. She moved straight to Leo's crib. Her entire demeanor softened the second she looked at the baby. Her hands, surprisingly gentle for a woman who just stood down, a mob boss, stroked the baby's sparse, dark hair. "Hey, little lion," she whispered, checking his IV lines and the pulse oximeter wrapped around his tiny toe. She efficiently swapped out his fluids and carefully adjusted his blankets. Dr. Pendleton took this interruption as an opportunity to escape. "I will consult with the genetics team, Mr. Costa. We will find an answer." He hurried past the bodyguards, leaving Gabriel alone with Phoebe and his dying son. Silence stretched in the room, save for the rhythmic, agonizing beep, beep, beep of the heart monitor. Gabriel leaned against the wall, the exhaustion of sleeping in hospital chairs finally catching up to him. "Is he in pain?" he asked, the harshness suddenly stripped from his voice, leaving only the raw, bleeding desperation of a father. Phoebe paused, looking over her shoulder at him. She saw past the $1,000 bespoke suit and the reputation of violence. She saw a terrified dad. "He's exhausted, Mr. Costa. His body is working overtime just to keep his organs functioning." Phoebe sighed, turning to face him fully. "I read his chart from top to bottom last night. Dr. Pendleton is brilliant, but he's a textbook doctor. He's looking for zebras, rare genetic anomalies. But something doesn't make sense to me." Gabriel stepped closer, his complete attention suddenly locked onto her. "What doesn't make sense?" "The timing," Phoebe said, crossing her arms. "Leo's vitals will stabilize for a day or two. He'll even keep down a few ounces of his amino acid formula. But inevitably, usually by the evening, he spirals. He vomits violently, his temperature spikes, and his blood pressure drops. Genetic disorders don't punch a clock, Mr. Costa. They are consistent. Leo's decline is episodic." Gabriel's brow furrowed. "What are you saying?" "I don't know yet," Phoebe admitted, biting her bottom lip. "But I need you to do something for me. I need you to tell your guards that nobody, and I mean absolutely nobody, feeds Leo, touches his IV, or brings anything into this room except me. Not the doctors, not your staff, not even you." Paranoia, cold and sharp, flooded Gabriel's veins. In his world, a pattern meant only one thing: a hit. But a hit on a baby? "You think someone is doing this to him?" Gabriel whispered, the temperature in the room seeming to drop 10 degrees. "I think," Phoebe said firmly, "that we need to eliminate every single variable. And if I'm right, we'll know by tomorrow." For the next 48 hours, Phoebe practically lived in Leo's room. She pulled back-to-back shifts, sleeping in the uncomfortable vinyl recliner in the corner of the VIP suite whenever another trusted NICU nurse covered her breaks. True to his word, Gabriel enforced her mandate with terrifying precision. No one entered the room without Phoebe's explicit approval. During the quiet, dimly lit hours of the night shift, a strange, unspoken bond began to form between the hardened crime boss and the fiercely protective nurse. Gabriel watched Phoebe work. He watched the way she hummed soft, off-key lullabies to calm Leo when the abdominal cramps struck. He watched the dark circles deepen under her eyes, a testament to her dedication to a child that wasn't hers. "You don't have to stay, you know," Gabriel said softly, around 3 a.m. on the second night. He was sitting on the edge of the leather sofa, swirling a cup of terrible hospital coffee. "You've been off the clock for 4 hours. Phoebe didn't look up from the monitor, her fingers gently resting on Leo's rising and falling chest. "I don't trust the night float nurses. They don't know his rhythms. Besides, I have a point to prove." "And what point is that?" "That he can get better," she said softly. And miraculously he was. Since Phoebe had instituted her strict lockdown, Leo had not had a single violent vomiting episode. For the first time in weeks, he had gained 3 ounces. His skin was losing its grey tint, flushing with a faint, healthy pink. Gabriel stood up, walking over to the crib. He looked down at his son, then at Phoebe. The proximity between them was suddenly palpable. She smelled like antiseptic soap and vanilla, a stark contrast to the cologne and expensive tobacco that usually surrounded him. "You saved him," Gabriel said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. "Whatever you did, it's working." "I didn't do anything, Gabriel," Phoebe replied, using his first name for the first time. "That's the terrifying part. I just stopped letting other people do things to him." The implications hung heavily in the air. The next morning, the illusion of safety shattered. Gabriel had stepped out of the hospital to attend a mandatory sit-down with his inner circle, a meeting regarding the upcoming union strikes at the docks. He had left Silvio at the door with strict orders. When Phoebe returned from a brief shower in the staff locker room, she found the heavy wooden door to the suite slightly ajar. Silvio was down the hall, distracted by a heated argument with one of the hospital administrators regarding a parking permit. Phoebe rushed inside. Standing over Leo's crib was Matteo, Gabriel's uncle, and the syndicate's long-serving consigliere. Matteo was a deeply respected elder in the Costa family, a man who had practically raised Gabriel after his father died. "Oh, nurse," Matteo said smoothly, pulling his hand back from the crib. He gave her a warm, grandfatherly smile. "I was just checking on our little prince. I brought him a gift." He gestured to a small, ornate silver pacifier clip sitting on the bedside table, next to a small, unmarked glass dropper bottle. "A family remedy for the stomach, an old Sicilian herbal blend. I slipped a few drops into his feeding tube while he slept, just like I used to do for Gabriel." Phoebe's blood ran ice cold. "You put something in his G-tube?" Before Matteo could answer, the heart monitor beside the crib blared a frantic, high-pitched alarm. Leo's tiny body seized, his back arching off the mattress. His lips rapidly turned a horrifying shade of blue. "Code blue! Room 412!" Phoebe screamed, lunging for the crib. She shoved the elderly Mafia boss out of the way with a force she didn't know she possessed. She hit the emergency button on the wall, her hands flying over Leo's tiny chest. He was in respiratory distress, his airway closing, his heart rate plummeting to dangerous levels. Doctors and nurses flooded the room seconds later. Chaos erupted. Defibrillator pads were ripped open. Epinephrine was drawn. Through the swarm of medical staff, Phoebe locked eyes with Matteo. The old man's face wasn't lined with panic or sorrow. It was entirely blank, cold. "He did this," Phoebe realized with a sickening jolt. "He's killing the baby." 20 agonizing minutes later, they managed to stabilize Leo. He was placed on a ventilator, his chest rising and falling mechanically. Dr. Pendleton was pale, frantically writing notes. "It was an acute anaphylactic-like shock," the doctor muttered. "Complete systemic collapse. I don't understand." Phoebe didn't wait to hear the rest of his theories. She turned on her heel, grabbed the unmarked glass dropper bottle from the bedside table, and slipped it into her scrub pocket. 10 minutes later, she cornered an old friend of hers, a toxicologist named David, who worked in the hospital's subterranean laboratory. She practically shoved the glass bottle into his chest. "David, I need you to run this through the mass spectrometer, right now, off the books." "Phoebe, I can't just—" "A baby is dying upstairs, Dave. Please, look for heavy metals, plant toxins, anything that mimics severe GI distress and causes episodic systemic organ failure." An hour later, Gabriel Costa stormed into the hospital, his eyes wild, his aura radiating pure, lethal intent. He had received the call about the code blue while en route to his meeting. He shoved past the medical staff, bursting into the VIP wing, demanding answers. He found Phoebe standing in the empty hallway outside the NICU, holding a printed lab report. Her hands were shaking. Gabriel grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip tight enough to bruise. "What happened? Where is my son? Why is he on a machine?" Phoebe looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes, but her jaw was set with fierce determination. "He's alive, Gabriel, but you need to listen to me very carefully. Your doctors were wrong. Leo doesn't have a genetic disease." Gabriel stared at her, his breathing heavy. "Then what is it?" Phoebe held up the piece of paper. "It's called colchicine. It's an incredibly toxic plant alkaloid, usually used in microdoses for severe gout. But in an infant, it causes severe vomiting, weight loss, bone marrow suppression, and eventually cardiac arrest. It perfectly mimics severe failure to thrive." Gabriel went completely still. The silence in the hallway was deafening. "Someone poisoned my son." "Yes," Phoebe breathed, "and I know exactly who did it." The sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway of New York Presbyterian felt like a vacuum, sucking the oxygen straight from Gabriel Costa's lungs. He stared at the printed toxicology report, fluttering slightly in Phoebe's trembling hand. The words, "colchicine toxicity," blurred before his eyes. "Matteo," Gabriel whispered, the name tasting like ash on his tongue. "He was standing right over the crib," Phoebe said, her voice dropping to a fierce, urgent hush. She grabbed Gabriel's forearm, her fingernails biting into his expensive wool suit jacket. "He told me it was a Sicilian herbal blend. He admitted to putting it in Leo's feeding tube. 10 seconds later, Leo crashed. Gabriel, you have to understand the pharmacology of what he used. This wasn't a clumsy assassination attempt. It was a calculated, undetectable torture." Phoebe pulled out her medical tablet, pulling up a deeply complex cellular diagram. "Look at this," she instructed, her professional training overriding her terror. "Colchicine binds to tubulin. It literally stops cells from dividing. In an adult with gout, it reduces inflammation. In a 4-month-old infant, it halts mitosis in the gastrointestinal tract. It strips the stomach lining, preventing the absorption of any nutrients. It meticulously mimics failure to thrive while slowly shutting down the bone marrow and kidneys. Dr. Pendleton missed it because he was looking for a broken gene, not a poison specifically chosen to replicate a genetic failure. If Matteo hadn't gotten impatient and given him a massive overdose today." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Gabriel turned away, placing both hands flat against the cold plaster wall. For a terrifying minute, he didn't speak. He didn't move. He was a man who had built an empire on loyalty. Matteo was his father's oldest friend. Matteo had taught Gabriel how to tie a Windsor knot, how to shoot a .38 special, and how to bury his grief when his wife, Sarah, died from an amniotic fluid embolism during Leo's delivery. The realization that the man who had wiped Gabriel's tears at the funeral was the same man systematically murdering his only remaining piece of Sarah snapped something fundamental inside the Mafia boss. When Gabriel finally turned back to Phoebe, the desperate father was gone. Staring down at her was the ruthless head of the Costa Syndicate. His dark eyes were utterly dead, devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "Where is he now?" Gabriel asked, his voice eerily calm, a chilling contrast to the violent storm brewing beneath his skin. "He went down to the cafeteria on the 2nd floor when the code blue was called," Phoebe replied, instinctively taking a half-step back from the sheer force of Gabriel's aura. He played the panicked grandfather perfectly for the nursing staff. "Gabriel, what are you going to do?" You can't just kill him in a hospital. The feds already have task forces crawling all over your Hudson Yards development project. If you start a war here, Child Protective Services will take Leo the second he's stable. Gabriel's jaw ticked. She was right, and it infuriated him. Matteo was a deeply entrenched consigliere. He controlled the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and had half the Brooklyn capos in his pocket. A direct, public hit would fracture the family and put a massive target on Leo's back. "I won't touch him here," Gabriel said, pulling a burner phone from his inner pocket. He dialed a number, his eyes never leaving Phoebe's. "Silvio, get a detail of our most trusted men, only the ones who report directly to me, no one from the Brooklyn crew. Lock down the VIP pediatric wing. Matteo is not to leave the building, but do not let him know he's a prisoner. Tell him I need him to handle the police inquiries regarding the baby's collapse." He hung up and looked at the nurse, who had just risked her career, and likely her life, to save his son. "What is the treatment for this poison?" Gabriel demanded. "There is no direct antidote for colchicine," Phoebe explained, her tone softening as she saw the flicker of paternal panic return to his eyes. "We have to provide aggressive supportive care. Gastric lavage is useless now because it's already in his bloodstream. We need to push massive amounts of IV fluids to flush his kidneys, administer broad-spectrum antibiotics to prevent sepsis, since his white blood cell count is plummeting, and keep him on the ventilator until his respiratory muscles recover. I've already altered his chart. I locked the electronic medical record under a Jane Doe protocol so no other staff can see the toxicology results." Gabriel reached out, his large, calloused hand gently cupping Phoebe's cheek. The gesture was shockingly tender, causing Phoebe's breath to hitch in her throat. "You are the only person in this God-forsaken city who hasn't lied to me," he murmured. "Keep him breathing, Phoebe. I will handle the rot in my house." For the next 12 hours, the VIP suite became a heavily armed fortress. Two of Gabriel's most lethal enforcers stood outside the door, while Phoebe remained glued to Leo's bedside. The infant looked incredibly small amidst the maze of tubing and wires. Phoebe meticulously monitored his central line, watching the saline drip with hyper-focused anxiety. She drew blood every 2 hours, sending it directly to her friend David in the subterranean lab to monitor the toxin's half-life. Around midnight, the heavy mahogany door opened. Gabriel stepped inside. He looked exhausted, the sharp lines of his face shadowed by the dim lighting of the medical monitors. He had spent the last several hours orchestrating a silent, bloodless coup. He had frozen Matteo's offshore accounts, redirected the syndicate's shipping manifests, and quietly isolated the consigliere's loyalists. Gabriel walked over to the crib, his shoulders slumping as he looked at the rhythmic rise and fall of Leo's chest, dictated by the hissing ventilator. "His kidney function is stabilizing," Phoebe whispered, stepping up beside him. She offered him a cup of lukewarm tea. "The toxin is clearing. He's a fighter, Gabriel." Gabriel took the tea, their fingers brushing. A jolt of unexpected electricity sparked between them, a sudden flare of life amidst the proximity of death. He looked down at her, really looked at her. He saw the fierce intelligence in her blue eyes, the exhaustion she was bravely ignoring, and the unwavering dedication that had saved his bloodline. "Why did he do it?" Phoebe asked softly, breaking the heavy silence. "A baby, Gabriel." "Why?" Gabriel stared into the dark liquid in his cup. "Power," he answered, his voice rough. "When Sarah died, I fell apart. For 2 months, I barely ran the syndicate. Matteo stepped in. He tasted the absolute authority he had always been denied as my father's second-in-command. But then, I came back. I took the reins again, because I had to build a safer empire for Leo." Gabriel set the cup down, his hands curling into fists. Matteo knew that as long as Leo lived, I would remain focused, ruthless, and untouchable. But if I lost my son so soon after losing my wife, Matteo calculated that the grief would finally break my mind. I would step down or put a bullet in my own head, leaving the entire Costa Empire to him. He was poisoning my son to steal my throne. Phoebe shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. The sheer, calculated evil of it was difficult for her civilian mind to process. What happens now? Now, Gabriel said, stepping closer to her, his presence utterly enveloping. The trap snaps shut. At 2 a.m., the hospital corridors were suffocatingly silent. Matteo walked confidently out of the private elevator, leading to the VIP pediatric floor. He had spent the day playing the devastated uncle flawlessly, fielding calls from concerned capos and keeping the hospital administration at bay. Now, he needed to finish the job. The baby had somehow survived the afternoon's massive dose of colchicine, and Matteo couldn't risk the doctors finding the anomaly. He carried a small syringe in his pocket, filled with an untraceable bolus of potassium chloride. A quick injection into the IV line, and the baby's heart would simply stop. A tragic, expected end. Matteo approached room 412. The hallway was strangely empty. Gabriel's usual guards were entirely gone. Matteo smiled grimly, assuming Gabriel had dismissed them in his blinding grief. He pushed open the heavy wooden door. The room was pitch black. The hissing of the ventilator had stopped. The medical monitors were completely dark. Matteo froze, his hand tightening around the hidden syringe. "Gabriel," he called out softly. "He's not here, Matteo." The voice came from the darkest corner of the room. A single, harsh overhead light snapped on, illuminating Gabriel Costa sitting in the vinyl recliner. He wasn't weeping. He held a suppressed 9mm Beretta, the barrel resting casually against his knee. Matteo's eyes darted to the crib. It was completely bare, the medical equipment stripped away. "Where is the boy?" Matteo asked, his voice betraying a slight tremor. "Safe," Gabriel replied smoothly, his dark eyes dead and unblinking. "On a medevac helicopter, headed to a secure facility upstate, accompanied by the only nurse I will ever trust." Matteo raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Gabriel, my boy, what is this? I came to check on little Leo. The nurses said what I told them to say." Gabriel interrupted, his voice dropping to a terrifying, lethal octave. He tossed the small, unmarked glass dropper bottle onto the empty mattress. "Colchicine. An elegant choice, uncle. Slow. Undetectable. Cruel." Matteo looked at the bottle, the blood draining from his face. The grandfatherly facade melted away instantly, replaced by a cold, hardened mobster. The doctors were fools. Who figured it out? "Someone who actually cared whether my son lived or died," Gabriel said, slowly standing up. "Your offshore accounts are drained. Your loyalists were arrested by the FBI an hour ago on an anonymous tip. You have nothing left, Matteo. No money, no men, and no family." Matteo sneered, realizing the trap had closed permanently. "You're soft, Gabriel. The boy is weak. The syndicate needs a wolf, not a grieving widower nursing a crippled cub." Gabriel didn't shout. He simply raised the weapon. "My son is a Costa, and he is going to live a long, beautiful life, far away from the poison you brought into this family." Pft, pft. The suppressed shots were shockingly quiet in the soundproofed suite. Matteo collapsed onto the linoleum, the syringe rolling uselessly from his dead fingers. Gabriel pulled out his phone. "Silvio, room 412 requires cleaning. Prepare the jet. I'm going upstate." 3 weeks later. The sunlit sunroom of Gabriel's heavily fortified estate in the Adirondacks smelled of fresh pine and lavender. Phoebe sat in a plush armchair, gently rocking a sleeping Leo. The transformation was miraculous. Free from the poison, Leo had gained 4 pounds. His cheeks were round and flushed, and his breathing was deep and even. The heavy oak doors opened, and Gabriel walked in, trading his intimidating city suits for a soft cashmere sweater. The dark shadows that had haunted his eyes for months had finally lifted. He knelt beside the chair, his large finger gently stroking Leo's soft cheek. "Dr. Pendleton called," Gabriel said softly. "He's still trying to take credit for a spontaneous, genetic remission." Phoebe smiled, a genuine, warm expression. "Let him publish his papers. We know the truth." Gabriel shifted his gaze to Phoebe. Over the past 3 weeks in isolation, their dynamic had shifted from frantic survival to something profoundly intimate. She had seen the monster he was capable of being, yet she hadn't run. "I bought a private pediatric research hospital in Manhattan this morning," Gabriel stated casually. Phoebe blinked. "You bought an entire hospital?" "I need a chief administrator, someone who doesn't look for zebras when a child is dying." "Gabriel, I'm just an ICU nurse." "You know how to save lives," Gabriel corrected, tracing her jawline. "And you saved mine. I don't want you to just be my employee, Phoebe. I want you in our lives. Permanently." Phoebe looked at the healthy baby, then at the formidable man offering his heart entirely without shadows. She leaned forward, pressing her lips softly against his. "Okay," Phoebe whispered against his lips. "Let's build something good." Gabriel Costa's empire of shadows was entirely dismantled by the pure, blinding light of a mother's fierce, surrogate love. Mateo's calculated betrayal was erased, leaving behind a revolutionized medical foundation run by Phoebe Bennett. As Gabriel watched Phoebe teach a healthy, thriving Leo how to take his first steps on the estate lawn, he finally understood true power. It wasn't found in striking fear, but in fiercely protecting love.